Good day, and welcome to today's virtual book talk on Catastrophe and Rebirth, 1939 through 1973, the latest volume of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. I'm Lenore Bell, Director of the Library at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I'm pleased to have with us today key individuals responsible for the newly released Volume 9 of the multi-volume anthology, and our distinguished speakers will be formally introduced shortly. Those of us involved with the field of Holocaust research and education have been alarmed by a recent study that exposed the high percentage of young adults in the U.S. who lack a basic understanding of the Holocaust. Now, nearly a quarter of those surveyed said that they believed that the Holocaust was a myth, had been exaggerated, or they just weren't sure. We continue to look for new resources for educators, students, and the public to help reverse such disturbing trends. And I know from the researchers that we serve at the museum's library that diaries, memoirs, other forms of testimony, as well as literary and artistic works resonate especially with students. One mission of the museum is to rescue the evidence of the Holocaust. And each testimony, document, or artifact that we acquire, preserve, and make accessible functions as a building block in documenting the history, and as a form of evidence, serves as a rejoinder to those who deny, distort, or diminish the history. Resources that further enhance and broaden access to primary sources assist us in our mission. The Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization provides direct access to selections translated into English from thousands of primary sources, reflecting Jewish creativity, diversity, and culture worldwide. The ambitious project will span biblical times to the 21st century when complete. The new volume, Volume 9, covers within its scope the Holocaust and its aftermath, the founding and development of the State of Israel, and the post-war evolution of Jewish communities and civilization in the diaspora. The volume presents a wealth of primary sources from the period and creates a new tool to challenge the trend of misinformation. I look forward to hearing our speakers describe their methodology for selecting sources from the vast universe of possibilities. I'm curious to learn what criteria were applied to ensure the diversity of experiences, geography, nationality, gender, and genre. I was excited to find that the anthology brings to a broader audience some remarkable lesser-known works also held in the museum's collection. And I'm very interested in the challenge of translation in an anthology of this scale, as well as the rationale behind the structure of the anthology. The Posen Library celebrates anthology as a genre within the Jewish literary canon, and with its inclusion of selections from notable anthologies, it really functions as a meta-anthology. When the Posen Library first contacted me many months ago about the prospective release of Volume 9, I was especially interested in the online platform, the Posen Digital Library. The museum has been preparing to expand research services to our David and Phyllis Chappell family Collections, Conservation, and Research Center. In addition to being a state-of-the-art facility for the preservation of our collections, the Chappell Center will serve as a hub for curatorial and research activities. In order to serve researchers effectively across the museum's campuses and across the world, we have sought to increase the volume of digital resources within our holdings. At the time of my initial contact with my associates at the Posen Library, I could not have imagined that a public health crisis would require us to suspend on-site access to collections, to pivot to an all-virtual reference service, and to shift acquisitions from print to electronic resources. In professional library circles, there was a flurry of activity to collaborate with publishers and other content providers to ease access and licensing restrictions in order to adapt to the new virtual research environment. The Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization was ahead of the curve, providing its rich content on the web to any researcher or reader, with the only requirement being free online registration. Today's program will include a brief demo of the Posen Digital Library and its research-enhancing features. The Posen Library establishes an important model that I hope will be emulated, a philanthropic enterprise to support the production of an open access resource meeting the highest standards of academic publishing. Now, before we proceed with the program, just a quick note about housekeeping. I encourage our audience to note any questions in the Q&A box, and at the conclusion of the presentations, our speakers will entertain as many questions as feasible. Please also note any technical issues. Our special events coordinator, Amanda, is on hand to assist. And now I'm pleased to introduce Daniel Posen, co-founder and CEO of the Posen Foundation and founding member of the Trafigura Multinational Commodity Trading Company. Daniel has been an active partner in promoting the values of Judaism as a culture and making Jewish heritage accessible to all. And now I turn the virtual spotlight to Daniel Posen.
Thank you, Leonor. Hello, I'm Daniel Posen, and I'm honored to present Volume 9, Catastrophe and Rebirth, 1939 to 1973, edited by Professors David Roskies and Samuel Kassow, to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for their permanent collection. I want to recognize the staff at the museum who have worked so hard to make this event happen. Amanda Bell, Amy Burke, and librarian Leonor Bell. Thank you all. And Leonor, I pass you now virtually the book to your museum.
Well, thank you, Daniel. As I mentioned earlier, I'm grateful for the Posen Digital Library during this period of remote research, but I also appreciate a beautifully printed book. So I want to thank you and thank the Posen Library for the donation of Volume 9, Catastrophe and Rebirth, actually, as well as Volume 8, Crisis and Creativity Between World Wars, 1918 to 1939. And I look forward to adding both print volumes to the museum's library collection. And now I return the virtual podium back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Lenore. It is with great pleasure that I introduce this event for the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, a series that my father, Felix Posen, and I are proud to continue to support. Felix and my mother, Jane, are in fact both watching tonight from their home in New York City and send you their best wishes. The Posen Library was, after all, his brainchild, my father. In the early 2000s, Felix gathered leading scholars in the United States and Israel to think about ways to ensure that all people who read English, and especially all Jews, could easily access a variety of Jewish sources, secular as well as sacred, literature as well as philosophy, paintings as well as ritual objects, North Africa and Argentina as well as Eastern European. This esteemed group came up with the idea for the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, a 10-volume printed compilation of primary sources, global Jewish writing and art from the biblical period to the 21st century, published by Yale University Press. Even the smart scholars in the room with my father back in the early 21st century could not have predicted coming changes. Responding to digital education, we developed an online interactive version of the Posen Library. The Posen Digital Library, which can be found at posenlibrary.com, is now free upon registration to every reader. The Posen Library is just one of the Posen Foundation's projects to highlight the diversity of Jewish culture and experiences. In Israel, the Posen Foundation works with educators to consider their own identity and the multiple backgrounds of their students when developing curricula. Posen Foundation programs have now reached more than 80,000 pupils and more than 200 schools. By mid-2021, half of the Posen Library will be complete, and the other half is not far behind. Once finished, the Posen Library will make available more than 7,000 pieces of Jewish culture from around the world. This could not happen, of course, without the dedication of our Editor-in-Chief, Deborah Dash Moore, as well as many staff members, volume editors, advisors, researchers, translators, and contributors. To learn more about the Posen Library, Here's a short video.
I'm really thrilled to be able to introduce our speakers this evening. I'm Deborah Dash Moore. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. In my day job, I am also the Frederick G.L. Heatwell Professor of History at the University of Michigan. I am a historian of American Jews, an author of a number of different books, and I'm here by virtue of my editorial capacity. So with that, let me just say a couple of brief words about our two co-editors of Volume 9, Catastrophe and Rebirth. Sam Kassow is Charles Northam Professor of History at Trinity College and the author of many studies on Russian and Jewish history. I will mention one, Who Will Write Our History? Emanuel Ringelblum, the Warsaw Ghetto, and the Oyneg Shabbos Archive. A very powerful study of the Jews who made history in Poland in those years. It received the Orbis Prize of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. He is partnered by David G. Roskies, who is Saul and Evelyn Henkin Professor of Yiddish Literature and Culture at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And David Roskies is also the author of many books. His major works include Against the Apocalypse, Responses to Catastrophe in Modern Jewish Culture, which won the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize from Phi Beta Kappa. Roskies was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2012. I could say much more, but I think it's time to turn it over to Sam and David. I want to ask you about your own life stories and backgrounds and the way in which these affected your vision of what this anthology should be. David, do you want to start?
Absolutely. So in Montreal, where I grew up, there was a shared passion for anthologies, lexicons, and encyclopedias, and it was always the work of one person. The most prolific anthologizer was the Yiddish poet Melech Ravitch, who was a close friend of my parents. Every few years, we celebrated the publication of another volume of his lexicon of Yiddish writers whom he had known personally. Then, in 1966, he produced a huge literary anthology about the Jews of Warsaw from 1414 to 1939. So what makes an anthology great, I asked myself. How come the Passover Haggadah was so central to our lives? And how come Maxwell House Coffee distributed Hebrew-English Haggadahs free of charge? Since, our Seder was nothing like the Seder described in the Bible, we had the Haggadah to thank for the whole ritual, for the libretto, for the script. The Haggadah is what created the Seder, not the other way around. So from the age of 16, I began working on public programs for Yom HaShoah. But it wasn't until I joined Chavorat Shalom in Somerville, Massachusetts, the granddaddy of the alternative minyanim of today, that I found the form that fit. Night Words, a midrash on the Holocaust. It was the first liturgy that wove together English, Hebrew, and Yiddish sources into one coherent commemorative ritual. And it came out a few years later in a beautiful yellow-bound booklet published by B'nai B'rith Hillel. So in the world that I grew up in, there was no conspiracy of silence about the Holocaust. In fact, my formative years were the high water mark of Yizkor books, memorial volumes dedicated to the Jewish communities that had been destroyed in the Holocaust. These anthologies were huge. They were folio-sized, collective efforts. They were compiled and edited and published by the Landsmannschaften, the hometown associations. So my second anthology was the Shtetl book, an introduction to East European Jewish life and lore, which built on my reading of Yiddish literature and on two informants from Tishavitz, Jacob Zipper and Yechiel Stern, both of whom lived in Montreal. So what kind of anthology had a longer shelf life? One that was time specific or place specific? Would it be Night Words or the Shtetl book? In other words, what did Jews remember best? Was it linked to time or was it linked to space? And that's where the Posen Library entered my life. The Jewish word for catastrophe is churban, the destruction of the temple. And when the Jews of my shtetl, Montreal, spoke of the Holocaust, they called it der dritter Churban, the third catastrophe. That's how I knew that the Holocaust was a link in the memory chain. And so the idea behind the literature of destruction, Jewish responses to catastrophe, my third anthology, was born. The idea was to go mihatanach va'ad hapalmach, from the Hebrew Bible to Israel's War of Independence. And it was on the strength of that 650-page anthology, lavishly published by Jewish Publication Society, that I was recruited to work on the Posen Library. Then something unexpected happened. Melech Ravitch came back to haunt both Sam Kassow and me. The story of Jewish Warsaw didn't end in 1939, and for both of us, the focal point became the Oyneg Shabbos archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, the greatest anthological project in Nazi-occupied Europe. Sam's masterpiece, Who Will Write Our History, on Emanuel Ringelblum, came out in 2007, which inspired Roberta Grossman to make her great documentary film of the same name, which in turn gave birth to this anthology, published last year by the Posen Foundation as a companion to Volume 9. So, the Posen Library is a meta-anthology, as Lenore said. It's something designed to last forever. And I think it will last forever because it is organized both chronologically and geographically. It links Jewish time with Jewish space.
Thank you, David. And I also want to say that I too grew up straddling two worlds. As a child of Holocaust survivors, I came to the US when I was about 3 years old. And I grew up in a tight community of survivors and their children in New Haven, Connecticut. On the one hand, we were part of the America of the 50s and 60s. But on the other hand, we were surrounded by the echoes of a lost world, by the sounds of the Yiddish language. We grew up at a time when Yiddishland was still alive, when the great writers were still there, when the daily Yiddish newspaper still came in the mailbox. And as I grew up, I developed a deeper and deeper curiosity about the world of my parents, about the world of pre-war Polish Jewry. And then I became a historian. And for many, many years, I decided that I would not write about the Holocaust. But then when I began to think about how the history of the Holocaust was being written in the United States, one thing bothered me. I noticed that especially in the United States and most other places outside of Israel, the research focused on the perpetrators, and the Jews just came across as a mass of faceless, anonymous victims. And the ghettos were just seen as holding pens for the death camps. And that really frustrated me. I knew that wasn't really true. I knew that these ghettos were still Jewish communities in their own right, still shaped to some degree by pre-war culture, that the Jews under Nazi occupation were still individuals. They had names. And I wanted to write an internal history of the Holocaust from a Jewish point of view. I wanted to break down what David Engel has called a wall that divided the history of the Holocaust from Jewish history. And this led to my work on Emanuel Ringelblum, his secret archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. And that's a work which discusses the culture of the ghetto. And from there, I became more and more interested in developing a synchronic comparison of Jewish communities in different places, reacting to the same events. And this, of course, was absolutely tailor-made for the anthology.
So thank you. It's really fascinating to hear from both a literary scholar and a historian how you came together. And in opening the volume, I was really struck with how it begins. It begins with anthologies, which I think is fantastic, but it begins specifically with Judeo-Arabic proverbs from Fez, an anthology that was published in 1939. What does this say about the Jewish world in 1939?
Well,
David?
Well, I was just going to explain how it happened that the book began this way, because the choice actually was completely serendipitous, and it was due to the anthological form itself. The person who found this source was Nina Lieftenstein, the member of our team who was responsible for French language materials. But it actually fell into place only in the 11th hour after we decided to begin each chapter with the genre of anthologies. So because it came out in 39-40, at the very beginning of our time frame, this compendium of Judeo-Arabic proverbs from the ancient community of Fez had to go first. But because it came first, it underscored the important role played by the Jewish intelligentsia of Morocco, already educated in French. They understood that the old folkways were dying out and the time had come to archive their local traditions. what they could not have known is that this rescue operation marked the beginning of the end of Jews in Arab lands.
And as many Jews looked around the world in 1939, the year that our anthology begins, they could only feel despair and humiliation. The great November pogrom, the Kristallnacht, had just taken place. The St. Louis, full of Jewish refugees, was turned back from Cuba. The British white paper seemed to have ended all hopes for a Jewish state. The Wagner-Rogers bill, which would have admitted Jewish children into the United States without their parents, died in Congress, a reminder of how unwanted Jews were. And there was this ironic and horrid disconnect between the reality of Jewish powerlessness and helplessness on the one hand, and Nazi accusations of a demonic, powerful Jewish conspiracy about to plunge the world into war. You remember, at the beginning of that year in 1939, Hitler says in the Reichstag, if the Jews succeed in plunging the world into war, it will not mean the defeat of Germany, it will mean the annihilation of the Jews in Europe. And then we fast forward to 1973, the last year of our period. Things are very different. It's ironic, too, that the reality of Jewish powerlessness is in some ways replaced by an exaggerated notion of Jewish power, which runs up against the reality of the Yom Kippur War. Nevertheless, the contrasts between 1939 and 1973 are absolutely striking.
So that's really so interesting. I'd like to pursue this anthology issue a bit more. The next anthology that you have in the volume is very, very different kind of project with a really different kind of message. And where is this one coming from?
So I first learned about this anthology from the 6-volume edition of the Jewish Underground Press in the Warsaw Ghetto that Yad Vashem published in Hebrew. Pein und Gvura, Suffering and Heroism, came out in mimeographed form, even before the ghetto walls were erected. And the edition I worked from was republished right after the war by the same Zionist youth movement, Dror HaChalutz. To my mind, it represents the hidden link between what we call spiritual and physical resistance. To make history, the young Zionists had to know history. It is surely no coincidence that 3 years later, the same Antek Zuckerman took over from Mordechai Anyalevich as commander-in-chief of the Jewish Combat Organization. But no less important from the anthological perspective is that 14 years later, in 1954, Zuckerman, who helped found Kibbutz Lochamei HaGhettoot, co-edited the Book of the Ghetto Wars. One would assume from the title, as I erroneously assumed, that Zuckerman and his co-editor, Moshe Basok, focused solely on the Jewish armed resistance. And the subtitle is Between the Walls, in the Camps, in the Forests. But in fact, in their literary supplement, they tried to embrace the whole emerging body of poetry and prose on the Holocaust, everything except for the poetry of Uri Tzvi Greenberg, who was anathema to the left-wing kibbutz movement. So I would say that the guiding spirits of our anthology were Melech Ravitch and Antek Zuckerman, with Leo Schwartz as the American muse.
So this first anthology put together by Eliyahu Gutkovsky and Yitzhak Zuckerman in Nazi-occupied Warsaw in 1940, Pein und Gvura, really implores Jews to study their history, and that history can become a source of reassurance and a recapture of spiritual wholeness. And it reflects the fact that before World War II, as much of Polish Jewry was going through a process of secularization, history becomes, this is not a new expression, but history becomes the new religion of secular Jews. If secular Jews lose their faith in the details and the practices of Jewish tradition, they could at least take some comfort in studying the Jewish past, knowing that the lessons of the Jewish past might provide new sources of pride and a new sense of peoplehood. Gutkowski and Zuckerman, putting together this anthology in 1940 under Nazi occupation, but totally unaware of the horrors that were to come, for them, the study of Jewish history was a no-brainer. And by the way, all these anthologies in the Posen Library encourage people to find different ways at their own pace to explore the interconnectedness of Jews with their past. And so I end with a modest plea to our audience on behalf of the Posen Library to probe the various ways in which different events of Jewish history link up with each other.
So one last anthology question. What about the very final anthology that's included in the volume, the Jewish catalog? You say a couple words about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because the Warsaw anthology, which I just talked about, was the first anthology in the volume. And the last, the Jewish catalog, is published in 1973. So the first, edited by Gutkowski and Zuckerman, reflect wartime dystopia. The second, the individual opportunities that Jews encountered in a changing America. And just to quote what the Strassfelds are doing, the orientation is to move away from the prefabricated, spoon-fed, nearsighted Judaism into the stream of possibilities for personal responsibility and physical participation. This entails a returning of the control of the Jewish environment to the hands of the individual through accessible knowledge of the what, where, and how of contemporary Judaism. And I would add that both anthologies, not just the Strassfeld anthology of 1973, responding to the opportunities and the pitfalls of American liberty, to the attempts to preserve Jewish identity, not just that anthology, but even that first anthology put together in Warsaw in 1940, they both are trying to move away from what the Strassfelds called prefabricated Judaism. The Jewish catalog for obvious reasons, but the Gutkowski and Zuckerman in 1940 are also trying to find some other footing for Jewish identity and Jewish consciousness apart from Orthodox religion.
Okay, that's so interesting. I'm going to ask you now just to think about, in a more general way, what were some surprises that came out of the volume? What did you learn from the process that you didn't know before? I noticed in your acknowledgements that you recognize it took a long time, 16 years to actually produce this volume. So what did you learn from this time spent anthologizing?
So here's the thing. I learned to see the war years through an anthological lens. Seen anthologically, there were two wars and there were two war zones. The Jew zone had its own geography of ghettos and camps and Aryan sides and forests and had its own calendar of deportations and actions and final liquidations. And VE Day wasn't the same everywhere. The free zone were those Jews living in Great Britain and the British Commonwealth, eastern half of the Soviet Union, the United States, Latin America, and the tiny Yishuv in Mandatory Palestine. Jews in the free zone were struggling with indifference, disbelief, and despair. Seen anthologically, the two parallel universes, these two narratives, appear back to back for the first time. So let's take a look at the next visuals. In both, you will note that women are in the foreground. So what does this tell us about the role of women in the iconography and memory of the war? So we have this extraordinary photo. It's a visual icon of what we now call Holocaust. To interpret this photo, we don't need to know the subsequent fate of the ship Patria, which was blown up in Haifa harbor by the Haganah. The way the three women figures are contorted and pressed together on board ship, the fact that we see them only in profile with their gazes averted from the camera, bespeak the tragedy of Jewish refugees desperate to flee Europe. Now for the next slide. Were it not for the Hebrew inscription, we would have no way of knowing that the woman and man in uniform are supposed to represent the young Jews of Mandatory Palestine who could fight the Germans only in British uniform, which they did. So from the Jewish anthological perspective, the Second World War and the war against the Jews came together in 1943. We did not know this before we began work on the Posen Library and probably would never have known it. So here are two more examples. When you look at this period anthologically, the two zones suddenly appear to be contiguous. Because the Vichy regime in France and its anti-Semitic policies reached as far as Morocco, resistance to that regime took many forms, such as this remarkable pamphlet, all copies of which but one were destroyed in 1942. Now for the next slide. This cover design from Peretz Markish's first book of wartime poetry says it all. Soviet Jews, 500,000 strong, were fighting in the Red Army, both to avenge the mass murder of the Jewish people and to protect their homeland. The return of Yiddish publishing to Moscow in 1943, it was itself proof positive that the Red Army had turned the tide of the war. Peretz Markish was the greatest Soviet Yiddish poet of this period. Included in Volk und Heimland is Markish's remarkable poem, A Mirror on a Stone, A Spiegel auf a Stein, his great personal lament for the destruction of East European Jewry, which appears separately in the poetry section of chapter 1. This period is so complex, its landscape is so extreme, its chronology is so important that Catastrophe required a separate chapter organized anthologically.
If we look at this slide 10, which was composed in the Soviet Union in 1943 at the height of the war, we see 1943 here as what one might call the last plastic moment of Soviet Jewry. The last time when for Soviet Jews, there was still grounds for optimism about their future in that country. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were fighting in the Red Army. Jewish scientists and engineers were helping the Soviet war effort, designing tanks and planes. Much of the younger generation of Soviet Jews were sincere and loyal Soviet patriots. And the Soviet Union seemed to be the most powerful force arrayed against fascism. The Red Army was doing the heavy lifting in the fight against Hitler. And many Jews sincerely saw the Soviet Union as their best hope, especially many Jews outside the USSR who were all too aware that Great Britain had betrayed the Zionist cause in 1939. But then came the Battle of Stalingrad and the steady increase of official anti-Semitism. Official anti-Semitism, new restrictions on admission to universities, the hostility of party officials becomes ever more alarming. And the relationship between the Soviet Union and its Jewish citizens would never be the same. And it showed a steady deterioration, which peaked between 1948 and 1953, and then kind of leveled off at a rather unpleasant plateau.
So we're here now, of course, in the United States. Could you say perhaps a little bit about what's happening in the U.S. In these years or immediately after?
Yeah, I mean, one of the genuine surprises that I felt when I was helping to put together this anthology was the degree to which, right after the Holocaust, you saw the determination of American Jewry to recover and to restart Jewish life, especially if you compare this to what American Jewry was going through and feeling in the 1930s. In the 1930s, before World War II, you might say that American Jewry was going through hard times. The Depression, powerful anti-Semitism, the inability to get the US government to adopt a more liberal refugee policy. Culturally, American Jewry was much less vibrant than Polish Jewry. Many young Jews, children of immigrants, seemed to be ashamed of being Jewish. But then after World War II, there's a real change. And you see it not just in a determination to help Israel, to stand up for Jews in trouble, perhaps sparked by a sense of guilt that they didn't do more to help European Jews during the Holocaust. But what's surprising and what really stands out in the anthology is a new intellectual assertiveness that American Jewry can indeed take on the burden and responsibility of leading the Jewish people after the Holocaust. Salo Baron, the foremost Jewish historian in the United States, expresses unbounded confidence in Jewish creativity, which he says can flourish in an open society. The Jewish scholar Gerson Cohn is saying that America's openness is good for the Jews. The year 1945 sees the first issue of Commentary magazine, which would become a very important journal in post-war Jewish America. And in his introductory article, An Act of Affirmation, Commentary's editor, Elliot Cohn, sees the establishment of this new journal as, I quote, an active faith in our possibilities in America. Surely we who have survived catastrophe can survive freedom too.
So what other forms of self-expression took shape in this time period you find distinctive?
No doubt, one of the most important forms of Jewish self-expression in this time period, in this anthology, is the centrality of what we would call life writing. In these years, where so many Jews, where entire Jewish communities are displaced and uprooted, life writing conveys the immediacy of Jewish experience, the myriad ways that Jews as individuals understood and acted out their Jewish identity, remembered their own private stories, and embraced or rejected their Jewishness. One of the great virtues of life writing is that it didn't have to be coherent or consistent. It could be fragmentary, inchoate, emotional, Authors could define themselves by the language they chose to write in: Yiddish, Hebrew, French, Arabic, and many authors choosing to write in new languages. And this choice of language signals how authors define themselves and the kind of audiences they hope to reach. Life writing, more than any other genre, highlights one of the most important themes of the modern Jewish experience: the memory of place and the bonds of the family. In life writing, uprooted and scattered Jews can recall their roots, take refuge in family ties that often span many continents. You see a vast range of individuals, displaced, battered, now asking, what next? Where do I go? How do I start again? How do I pick up the pieces? And these pieces also include the memory of our former homes as building blocks for a new life. Life writing was especially important when Jews faced immediate danger, such as in Nazi-occupied Europe, or to a lesser degree, in an Israel facing constant conflict. Life writing was also important behind the Iron Curtain, where it was easier to pass the barriers of censorship, much easier, say, than writing about Jewish philosophy or Jewish thought. Mm-hmm. And there's a variant of life writing, i.e. reportage, which deserves special mention. Reportage as a genre was very important in the ghettos, and we find a lot of brilliant reportage in the secret ghetto archives. It was also an important form of self-expression in Israel's early years. Reportage explained, decoded, and described the microcosms of communities that were experiencing massive displacement and disorientation.
David, anything to add?
Yeah, yes, for sure. How about the songs that we still sing, from Donna, Donna, Donna to If I Were a Rich Man, and tradition, everything from the Partisans hymn to Like a Rolling Stone. This is the period that saw the birth of Israeli popular song. This is when the Negonic Renaissance began with Shlomo Carlebach's Essa Einai. Songs and song culture punctuate each and every chapter and tell their own story.
Songs were very important in the ghettos. In the ghettos, the space that separated the individual from the collective steadily shrank. What will happen to everybody is going to happen to me, and vice versa. We have a shared fate. We have shared fears, shared hopes, shared illusions. In the absence of privacy, in the absence of newspapers, radios, songs sung on street corners, sung in courtyards, could quickly bring people together. Songs were a public act. It was a collective act, but songs also celebrated the first sparks of resistance, like Hirsch Glick, a young poet who wrote the famous partisan hymn. And in this song, Still die Nacht ist gestern, he's celebrating the first act of armed resistance in Vilna. A young woman, Wittke Kempner, attacks a German truck. And there's a lot of poetic license here, because unless you believe that there's a heavy frost in June when this act took place, but you get the drift. And like many partisan songs, like many resistance songs, this song was set to a Russian folk melody, underscoring the fact that in the war, the Jews were looking east to the Red Army.
Nacht ist ausgesternt und der Frost hat stark gebrannt. Sie gedenkst du, wie ich hab dich gelernt, halten a Speyer in die Hand. Sie gedenkst du, wie ich hab dich gelernt, halten a Speyer in die Hand. So this was the first generation of Yiddish-speaking Jews ze halten a Speyer in the hand, a pistol, that they had to smuggle into the ghetto beforehand.
So we also have here an Israeli song, a song that was written by one of Israel's most important poets, Chaim Guri. The great Israeli writer Amos Oz said, "We had folk songs before we had a folk." And this song, Song of Friendship, which was composed in 1949, is emblematic of the War of Independence. Chaim Guri was part of that first generation, born in Israel, growing up speaking Hebrew, joining the elite strike force, the Palmach. It was a generation that suffered horrendous casualties, the generation that bore the burden of winning the War of Independence. Guri's generation faced a very serious challenge to overcome inevitable sadness and loss, to keep despair at bay, to focus on winning the war and getting a Jewish state. And what this is a song which, like many other songs of the War of Independence, recognize the horrible sacrifices, but at the same time, understanding that those sacrifices were not in vain. And as Alan Mintz reminds us, for secular Israelis who had left traditional Jewishness, the deep spiritual needs that they had could in part be satisfied by these new Hebrew songs and these new Hebrew poems. And in the early years of the state, when masses of immigrants arrived, usually knowing little Hebrew, it was Israeli song, collective singing, that became a critical bonding experience that helped knit the young nation together. Israeli culture had to develop at warp speed. And I think this is what Amos Oz meant when he said we had folk songs before we had a folk.
נזכור את כולם, את יפי הבלורית והתואר, כי רעות שכזאת לעולם לא תיתן את ליבם לשכוח. So in Israeli collective memory, they were the lost generation, the Yefei HaBlorit VaHaToar, the handsome of face and forelock. There was gorgeously unkempt and disheveled kibbutzniks in the prime of their life. But from now on, they would always be remembered in poetry, prose, drama, and later in film for their physical beauty and their shattered bodies. But listen, you shouldn't think that Jewish popular song always strikes a communal note, that the song is always either addressed to the plural you, or that every I is the whole collective, the whole nation speaking. That's definitely not the case, neither in Israel nor in the diaspora. The pre-war tradition of satiric cabaret songs, for example, did not die in 1939. So here is George Chrysler's song of Bitter Homecoming, translated from the German. Our brilliant translator, Suzanne Klingenstein, managed to preserve the rhyming couplets. I went to see my sister in Berlin, rhymes with, she wants me to consider moving in. And my favorite couplet is the next one. Her husband's passed away now, a schlemiel. He left her too much money in his will. But despite his sister's hospitality, her largesse, her opulence, the brother's brief visit ends with the refrain, I do not feel at home here, at home here, at home here. And this line is repeated 10 times as we follow his travels from Berlin to New York, to Buenos Aires, and finally to his true homeland, Israel, where he also doesn't feel at home.
So in my other capacity as co-editor of Volume 10, before it became the editor-in-chief of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, I edited volume 10 with Nurit Gertz. And we included translations from many different languages, but not nearly as many as yours. And I was particularly struck by a poem in yours that's translated from Afrikaans, a poem by Olga Kirsch, a Jewish South African poet. Could you say a bit more about translating, for example? What is the impact of translation on Jewish culture?
Yeah, so to begin with, the number of source languages in this volume is staggering. Here's a list in alphabetical order: Afrikaans, Arabic, Czech, Dutch, English, French, German, Hebrew, Hungarian, Italian, Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, Persian, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, Serbian, Spanish, and Yiddish. 19 languages in all. So Jews were forced to travel light, but they seem to have taken their languages along. The dispersion of languages in our period is a veritable Tower of Babel. But language is fate, something I learned from my sister, Ruth Weiss, and never more fateful than in our period. In what languages were Jews to rebuild their shattered lives? To know the answer, you need to read the short bios that precede each selection. Volume 9 is a who's who of German Jewish refugees who adopted English as their language of self-expression. Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim, Leon Feuchtwanger, Erich Fromm, Nachum Glotzer, Kurt Lewin, Joachim Prinz, Leo Strauss, Trudy Weiss-Rosmarin, and quite a few others. Then when you move on to chapter 2, Israel, 1946 to 1973, that chapter more or less opens with how to and why to choose yourself a Hebrew name. This time, what the short bios reveal is the drama of Zionist self-refashioning. You change your name, you change your language. Change your language and you become the first generation of Israeli prose writers, poets, and playwrights. Ludwig Pfeiffer becomes Yehuda Amichai. Beryl Friedman becomes Amir Gilboa. Moshe Tilimzoger becomes Dan Ben Amotz. Jerzy Orlovsky becomes Uri Orlev. Yechiel Perelmutter becomes Avot Yeshurun. And Harry Zeitelbach becomes Natan Zach, from A to Z. Later chapters reveal the making of Holocaust literature, those survivors who adopted the language of their place of refuge. Aaron Appelfeld, Katzetnik, Piotr Ravich, Elie Wiesel, Uri Orlev, and those who didn't: Paul Celan, Yaakov Lind, Leib Rochman, Chava Rosenfarb, Abram Sutzkever. Now, language was definitely fate for Jewish women from Arab lands who entered the ambience of French culture. Had these women remained in their native lands, Blanche Ben Dahan, Jeanne Ben Guigui, Elisa Shemini, De Grazia, Giselle Halimi, and Irma Yehu, well, they would never have made their voices heard. And if their names do not trip off my tongue, it's not because I've forgotten my French, it's because we only learned of their existence thanks to our work on this anthology. Anyway, this brings up a much larger question. What are the parts of Jewish culture that resist translation from one language to another? What is the key variable? The thing we learned is that the key variable is not language per se. Hungarian is no more difficult to translate than French. The key variable is genre. So as you just heard, of all the genres, life writing travels best from one language to another. It's like you're looking at a snapshot from a family album. Poetry, well, the American Yiddish poets like Jacob Gladstein, Aleph Leolis, Malka Chafetz Tuzman, they translate very well, as do the Israeli poets who adopted an understated Anglo-Saxon sensibility, like Yehuda Amichai and Natan Zach. What does suffer terribly is humor. And we knew this from the get-go, and you and I, Deborah, had more than one conversation on this subject. You wanted us to include more American Jewish humor. And I said that that would privilege America unfairly, that the Posen Library isn't addressed solely to American readers, especially when we found out that the whole library was going online. So this is what happened. In chapter 1 on the catastrophe, we excerpt 2 anthologies of Jewish humor that appear back to back. One from the Warsaw Ghetto, compiled in 1941 by Rabbi Shimon Huber Band, a key member of the Onyx Shabbos archive, and another by Rabbi Samuel Mendelssohn from Temple Beth Israel in Chicago. Well, this is altogether very surprising. 2 rabbis, one Orthodox and the other Reform, collecting Jewish humor in the early 1940s. Well, guess what? The jokes from Warsaw, translated from Yiddish, hold up much better than American Jewish humor from the Midwest. Maybe persecution gives humor a special edge. Maybe Orthodox rabbis are better joke tellers than Reform rabbis. Maybe the key to Jewish humor is Yiddish. So, what happens to Jewish humor when Hebrew replaces Yiddish as the Jewish vernacular? For the answer, we flip ahead to anthologies in Israel. And also, almost back to back, we find 2 famous collections, Dov Sadan's A Bowl of Raisins or 1001 Jokes, published in 1949, and Dan Ben Amotz and Chaim Hefer's counter anthology, A Bag of Lies, from the oral lore of the Palmach. Sadan was my teacher at the Hebrew University, and I wanted to do good by him. But for the life of me, jokes 602 to 608 that we excerpted are not funny, no matter how many times Sadan retells each joke and how well he explains its meaning. Compare that to the Chizbatim, or the tall tales of the Palmachniks that Dan Ben Amotz and Hefer collected. Well, they're extremely wacky. They are this weird blend of Middle Eastern humor, kibbutz bravado, and catch-22. In their introduction, Ben Amotz and Hefer poke fun at Sadan. Anyway, we were lucky that we also had the visual and material culture section to make up the difference. So we included a rich array of comic books. A, because Jews were especially prominent in this branch of American popular culture. And B, an image is worth 1,000 words, maybe 10,000 when you compare these words translated from another language.
So thank you. We're getting close to our time, but I wondered, Sam, if you could just sort of wrap up and speak very briefly about the structure of the volume. You've all mentioned that it starts with the Holocaust and then the state of Israel. But can you just say a little bit about the juxtaposition, what happens when chronology is used as an organizing tool?
Yeah, we while some of the volumes, while some of the other volumes really are organized according to genre, for our period, we simply had to understand that there was no alternative to chronology, i.e., 2 of the most dramatic events in Jewish history, the Holocaust, when 6 million Jews are murdered, and the establishment of a Jewish state. They happened within a 10-year period. Mass destruction on the one hand, the rise of Jewish sovereignty on the other, with all of its challenges, with all of its echoes, with all of its implications. And so for our entire period, I think we find it safe to say that unless a particular Jew were living on Mars, he or she would have been forced to think about, to ponder, to react to the impact and the resonance of these 2 events. And that's why chronology was simply so important, so salient, so vital, and that explains why the volume was organized the way it was.
That's great. So I'm going to now introduce Alison Joseph, who is a senior editor of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. She is a scholar of biblical literature and the author of Portrait of the Kings. And she's going to very briefly show all of us how we can, as it were, be our own anthologists by going online and using the Posen Digital Library.
Great, thanks, Deborah. So everything that we've talked about tonight and all of the great sources that can be found in David and Sam's volume 9, along with a number of other volumes that we have available, are currently online, where you can directly access all of these primary sources. Right now, we have selections from 1750 to 1880, 1918 to 1939, 1939 to 1973, and 1973 to 2005. This is 2,600 entries online and counting. So to get all of this at your home, all you have to do is register for free at www.posenlibrary.com. The registration will pull up this kind of sign in. It's pretty similar to any kind of Windows sign in. And that will get you access to these 2,600 and growing entries. Once you're on the Posen Digital Library, you will be able to search by keyword, subject, genre, date, and author or artist name. So we're going to just jump in and I will show you how this works. So when you land here on the posenlibrary.com, you have two options for a search. You could do a quick search right here with just a single word, or we're going to go to the advanced search over here.
You have to log in.
So I am already logged in. So once you register, you log in and it usually keeps you logged in. So today we're going to search for the word ghetto. So ghetto yields 206 results and it just files in here. We can sort this in multiple ways. I'm going to sort them by date. And so you see here, our earliest texts that we have available now online begin in 1750. Our first entry that has the word ghetto related to it is this Hanukkah lamp from 1770. And so in this search by date, you have this possibility of seeing all of the instances that the word ghetto is used. We know that ghetto comes from the 16th century. And so we can see its movement over time through these primary sources. But I think what we're really interested in tonight are ghettos as related to the Holocaust. So we have two different ways that we can refine our search results here. The first is by topic. You just click here, you have an alphabetical listing, and you see three different Holocaust listings, 47 entries for the Holocaust, 1 for Holocaust denial, and 11 Holocaust survivor. These are all entries that contain the word ghetto in them. What we're going to do is do a search by date. So we're going to put in the years of World War II, and we will further refine our search. Add this time as a filter, and great. So now it brings us back only 59 results, so it's much more manageable to and more focused on whatever your research purposes are. So I'm going to click here to the first result, the encyclopedia from the Łódź Ghetto, and you see some that I'll just point out some of the features of each entry. You can see our search word highlighted, each place that it's mentioned. Each entry, as Professor Roskies mentioned before, begins with an original biography that was put together and written by all of our scholarly experts and researchers and are unique to the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. So this is especially great for students. If anyone assigns this in their classes, to get a little bit of background on the biography of the author. This entry was written by Oscar Rosenfeld in 1943. If you want to get advanced, and we don't have time for this today, but we have all sorts of options for tagging the entries. you can save them into folders so that you can share your folders with other people. So I'm just going to scan down because we don't have time to read the entry and point out some of the other features. At the end of each entry, we have a translator. Many of our entries are translated anew or for the first time into English, or they've been republished from other translations. Other works by Rosenfeld. So since you love this piece, maybe you want to go read some more things. Or this is only an excerpt that you really want to read the entire Encyclopedia of the Ledge Ghetto. Here's where you can find it. The bibliography of this English translation, as well as where it was originally published in German. And so we have all of these features available on each of the entries. And so how can you find this? Again, you just need to register for free on the Posen Digital Library at www.posenlibrary.com. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where we have daily posts with search terms and entries and great pictures. That it's an excellent way to just sort of jump into our content and start to explore. Or you can always contact us at info@posenlibrary.com for further questions.
Thank you so much, Allison. So I think we have time for some questions. And the first question actually is a tough one, but I will start with it. It is, what did you choose not to include in this volume and why?
That is a tough question. There were, I don't remember discussing what we would excise, but I do remember things that we were denied access to by family members. Remember, we're in a period where there are living heirs who are jealously guarding the legacy. So I don't know if I'm revealing too many secrets from Cheder, but there was something by Peretz Markish from 1943, an article that he wrote about the new Soviet Jew. I thought it was an important statement of that very plastic moment that Sam spoke about, where patriotism was heartfelt, but the family didn't want us to publish it. They said it made him sound like an apparatchik,
I think it's
like a propagandist. On the other side of the spectrum, we wanted something from the American Council for Judaism, one of its founding members, and we found something that had been published in Life magazine, and the family wouldn't let us publish that. They didn't want his name associated with anti-Zionism. So I think those were actually the decisive choices that were made for us, not by us. Sam, do you have any other?
Yeah,
remember?
I think it was Bergelson.
I said. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. You're right.
Yeah,
it wasn't Markish. You're right. It was David Bergelson.
Right.
Thank you.
I mean, it's, you know, to say what did we ever sit down and say this poet, this writer, this painter is such a nobody, is such a jerk that we are going to make our day by keeping him out of the anthology? That never happened.
I think the person may have been thinking also about, you know, whether something was sufficiently Jewish enough or to be included.
Well, that's something else again. That's something else again. And as we say in the introduction to the anthology, we have excerpts from Oklahoma. We have excerpts from Dylan that on the face of it are not very Jewish, but for reasons that we explain in the introduction, they're addressing themes that we thought would merit inclusion in a Jewish anthology. Now that opens up a can of worms. I mean, there are many Jewish composers who did not really identify that much with Jewish culture, who were popular songwriters, who we don't have in the anthology, and one could very easily say that we should have included them. There are a lot of judgment calls. When you have a Soviet songwriter like Matvei Blanter, who was a very popular songwriter, composed a lot of popular songs during World War II in the Soviet Union. Why do we include Dylan in a Jewish anthology and not him? I don't know. There are just a lot of judgment calls.
Okay, so another question was about the time period. You go to 1973. Why 1973 and not 67? I mean, I have my own opinion about that since I, edited the volume about 73. But this question is to you. So, ending it in 73.
Wasn't our choice. You'll have to ask James Young. These decisions were made by what we called the Sanhedrin. There were a group of senior scholars who oversaw this whole project, and it was their call. We were given these dates and we had to work with them.
But I actually think that 73 is a good date, better than 67, because of what's going on in the world, because the turmoil of the late 60s doesn't stop at 67. There's 68 and 60, it just continues. 73 really does mark a change of what's happening in a lot of ways. Okay, so next question was, can you give us some examples of humor? That's good humor that works.
Okay. So, yes. So I mentioned Huberband's collection of ghetto humor. So here is from Huberband, collected it in 1940 or 41, as follows. Rubinstein. Rubinstein was a stand-up comedian who performed on the streets of the ghetto. Rubinstein says, I had a groschen, but I lost it. I had a Zweier, but I lost it. I had a Dreier, but I lost it. Only the Vierer, I can't seem to lose. So it's a pun. You got to get, the Führer. It's not a bad, that's a pretty good joke. Here's also from Huberband. God forbid that the war lasts as long as the Jews are able to endure it. So what does that mean? It means what is going to prevail? Yes, the monomaniacal, implacable German quest to render Europe Judenrein, free of Jews, or the stubbornness of Jewish survival. So it's a very Yiddish sensibility. But there's another version. He gives you two versions of the same joke. The other one, not so upbeat. How long will the hardships last? God forbid that the hardships last as long as the Jews can endure, because if the hardships last that long, who knows if they will really endure them? Okay, so that's Yiddish humor.
Okay, that's great. So here's a question. Would you say that the Posen Library has an ideological point of view? Based on today's presentation, it seems that the anthology is heavily weighted toward text, specifically non-religious text. Is this a fair observation?
I wouldn't say so. We have quite a few religious texts. We have Heschel, we have Soloveitchik, we have Prince, we have
from Israel, Yeshaya Leibovich.
Yeah. So I would say that what we did include were religious texts that were accessible to a wider audience, that were really publicized, that were widely read. We have Martin Buber, we have Judah Magnus.
Yeah, I think also there's a lot more visual material as well, but in a short presentation, one can't show all of it. I mean, there's just wonderful art, photography, reproductions of paintings, architecture, sculpture. I mean,
Plus
there's
a lot
just,
of ritual art. Don't forget ritual
yes,
art and synagogue architecture and talaisim. And, you know, there is this
yeah,
tremendous renaissance of Jewish ceremonial art in our period that is also reflected in the visual art section.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think we tried to cast as wide a net as we possibly could.
One of the things that's so great, in fact, in the visual culture section is the way in which the religious and the secular sit side by side, because you've got it chronologically. And so you can really see the influences back and forth. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Let's see. Just okay. I got a bunch of these. I'm trying to figure out what to add here. Does the anthology include responses of Jewish organizations outside Europe during the war?
Responses of Jewish organizations, it includes the responses of leaders of Jewish
Right.
organizations.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't, it's not, it's more oriented towards individuals who had leadership positions than the organizations per se.
Right.
Except for organizations that are dedicated to the project of the anthology, like the Leo Beck Institute, like Oyneg Shabbos, or for that matter, Brandeis University. So those are the kinds of organizations, if you will, that we spotlighted.
Great. Do you have anything, someone asks about the Jews who went to Shanghai? I don't know if any of them made it into the anthology or not. No. Oh, okay.
I don't think so.
Okay. This is.
But that said, we have a lot on German-speaking Jewry.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, from Czernowitz, from the Czech lands. So this is something that I think we cover very thoroughly.
Right, right. Okay, I think that I'm looking at the clock and we really should be wrapping up now. So I want to thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. You gave, I hope, all of our people who participated, as it's called, you know, remotely, a sense of the richness of this volume. It has really fantastic material. I've only really just started to dip into it and get to know the material somewhat better, and I'm fascinated by what you have. And I should turn it now over to Lenore, who I believe is going to say a few closing remarks.
Thank you, Deborah. I do want to, first of all, thank our audience today for joining us and for posing your questions. I would like to thank my museum colleagues who were behind the scenes: Amanda Bell, Amy Burke, Ashley Kolpak, Madeline Barnes, Ama Wuzu, Jaime Monyor. And I also want to thank my partner at the Posen Library, Joanna Ramos Boyer, and all these wonderful individuals provided outstanding support for the program today. And of course, I especially want to thank our presenters for such a fascinating program. Daniel Posen, Deborah Dash Moore, Samuel Kassow, David Roskies, and Allison Joseph. Really appreciated you all sharing your insights with us about Catastrophe and Rebirth, and about the Posen Library as a whole, and for making this remarkable anthology accessible in print and digitally to advance Holocaust research and education. And one final note, if anyone is interested in purchasing a copy of Volume 8 or Volume 9, you may do so by contacting the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum shop. There was a link in the confirmation emails, and Amanda is also posting the link in the chat. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and have a good evening.